Hello, everyone, and welcome to On Crime and Punishment, a podcast from the Center for Criminological Research. This is a brand new podcast that we're starting. We'll be releasing approximately once a month. So do go into the Apple Store and into Google Podcasts or anywhere else that you get your podcasts and subscribe. And don't forget to like our videos and subscribe to our YouTube channel for all of the most current content from the CCR. Today, Ashley Cole will be speaking with Dr. Temitope Oriola on his reflections on the Dereck Chauvin trial that just concluded in Minneapolis in the US, and the implications of that trial for the trial by jury system that has been used in most Western democracies now for, a couple of centuries. So enjoy, and again, subscribe and like.
Hello, Dr. Oriola. Thank you so much for joining us. You recently published an article for The Conversation, an independent news source that focuses on making accessible research and academic contributions for the wider public. In your April 20th article, you spoke about the guilty verdict in the trial of Dereck Chauvin and the need for criminal justice reform. Could you speak a bit more about what finding him guilty on all charges potentially represents on a larger scale?
Thank you very much for that, and thanks for having me. The Dereck Chauvin trial obviously was one that was closely followed globally as a test for the criminal justice system in the United States, obviously with serious implications for other countries, particularly countries that used trial by jury system. I find it very interesting that despite the overwhelming evidence, there really wasn't any certainty about how the jury might decide, in part because any of those 12 jurors might have held a contrary opinion, and there could have been a hung jury.
Right.
My point is that in and of itself is problematic. Because it gives room for the tyranny of a single juror. And we've seen over and over again in fairly spectacular cases from Eric Garner in New York and a few other instances across the states, and a few even here in Canada. And I recall the Colton Boucher murder trial. This, as you may recall, happened in Saskatchewan, and the verdict was not guilty. Now, these are key moments that put the criminal justice system in spotlight. I believe that Japan has devised a much more robust and sophisticated way of getting around that to solve that problem, so that a single individual does not derail the evidence or the what should be or an expected verdict given overwhelming televisual evidence. What Japan does in serious cases is to have about 6 quote unquote lay judges, or what we would call jurors, and match them with or rather have them side by side with 3 professional judges. So instead of a single judge, you have 3 judges. Now, a majority of the lay judges or jurors and 1 professional judge is all that you require to secure conviction. I believe that this is a more efficacious and a fairer and more reasonable way to adjudicate serious cases in society than the current system, in part because the trial by jury system has very historical roots. But I do not think it was designed for a multicultural societies. Now, I say that in part because when you look at some of the evidence coming out from studies upon studies, so not just the sensationalized cases and all of that, I'm thinking of a 2010 piece that was published in the Washington Law Review, I believe the journal is called, which looks at what it calls, quote, the racial geography of the death penalty. The authors find is that even when you hold the crime constant, in other words, a death penalty eligible offense following conviction, that whether or not the death penalty is imposed, and I'm not an advocate of the death penalty, just to be clear,
Hmm.
but whether or not the death penalty is imposed is a function of A, who you are, and B, where your crime was committed.
Right.
Uh, and that, when you have such a clear scenario with mounting decades of evidence vis-a-vis how cases end up, who gets tried and what kinds of sentences they get and all of that, and such that you can almost predict the outcome of a case by the demographics of the jurors. Now, I
Right.
find that troubling. I
Hmm.
think that that makes a mockery of the very idea of justice.
Hmm.
And interestingly, the issues with the jury system are standard first year conversations in law schools in common law jurisdictions. I took one of those classes myself as a law student at the University of London International. So these issues have been known for a while. What is surprising is that we soldier on like they do not
Right.
matter.
Yeah.
And the outcomes traumatize all communities. The Colton Boucher case, for instance, was a pivotal moment, a watershed moment here in Canada with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice both coming out to condemn the verdict. I don't think that such representatives of our government would have said a word about it if they didn't feel strongly that case was wrongly decided. So I
Right.
believe that if we would adopt something similar to what Japan has done, I think we do give ourselves a decent chance of ensuring equal justice under the law.
Right. Yeah, it was definitely one of the bigger criticisms is that aspect of homogeneity in the demographics of Japan compared to somewhere like the United States and Canada, and how that has distinct impacts on the way our judicial system works.
I mean, Japan is ethnically 98.1% Japanese.
Hmm.
But even they, went ahead to recognize the limitations that a jury might have, or lay judges, as they like to call them, and then have a panel, essentially, of judges. So that when you have all judges saying no, then you know that there is an issue. Maybe
Right.
the evidence isn't strong enough. So I think justice stands a better chance because the professional judges are individuals who know that their careers are at stake and that they will answer for each of their decisions in the fullness of time. And sometimes that's an important variable to have. But in instance, and keep in mind, we have what is called a peremptory challenge,
Hmm.
where essentially the defense can knock off jurors
Right.
for any to no reason whatsoever, although there have been efforts to make changes to that now in Canada.
Hmm.
And essentially, you could have a defense team if they're well resourced, picking those who would decide and already having a clear sense of how things might go. Again, in a diverse, multicultural setting, we should be preventing such gamed outcomes in serious or very
Right.
controversial racially charged cases.
Right. Yeah. Recently, the US Attorney General announced that they'll be investigating the city of Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department with major focuses on use of force, accountability, complaint intake, investigation, and discipline. And the DOJ also plans to actually survey community members about their experiences with the Minneapolis Police Department. How do you feel that the public will perceive this decision or has perceived this decision and the potential impacts it could have? Does this represent accountability for you?
Right. So whenever you have such investigations being set up, I understand people's apprehensions or sense that, oh, do we need another study to do this and all that? But bureaucracies work in certain ways, and there are policy constraints and even legal constraints that are on the ground. So even though what they may find are things that practically everybody else knows, they do need to prove and show the methodology and that there was in fact a scientific study and indicate their findings and so forth. And I recall that something similar was done with Ferguson in 2014, and that led to some changes. And the Department of Justice was unsparing in its deep dive into policing practices, where over 90% of tickets and 90%, over 90% of use of force incidents involved the Black residents, who were roughly 67% of the town. And the conclusion of the DOJ was that policing in Ferguson was not for public safety, it was for, quote, fine collection.
Right. Yeah.
So I think it's a welcome development, as long as the findings are implemented. I have no doubt that that would happen, given the very careful and clinical analysis of the Ferguson Police Department and the changes that were then introduced as a result of that. Again, because of the incredibly decentralized nature of policing in the United States. The US has over 18,000 police departments. And so there has to be a documented investigation upon which you can then base any external intervention from the DOJ. It's a federal system of government, and that has to be respected. These police units, over 18,000 of those police departments, all ranging from those like the NYPD or LAPD with thousands of to smaller, centers with 6 officers or 4 in some cases. They all are somewhat autonomous, but there is legal provision for DOJ intervention if they are abusing human rights. And so that cannot just simply go off of newspaper reports. You need formal investigations to have the local standard to intervene.
So this might be a broad question, I guess. What would be legitimate system change in policing? What would that look like? Or more specifically, how do you see the future of community police relations in the US?
Right. I think with the US, things are, at a boil right now in many ways. Because we've now come to learn that a 16-year-old girl was shot hours before the Chauvin verdict. And there's been at least one other shooting after that. So it does seem to be this endless cycle of seemingly unnecessary killings. I think at the minimum, there does seem to be this lackadaisical attitude towards human life. I find that troubling. These are people with families and friends and so forth. And so that calls for reforms with respect to the use of force. And that calls for a level of public engagement as well. I think that there has to be that recognition that this could happen to anyone, that there's a need to put in place concerted efforts to put an end to it. Essentially, whose son is next, whose daughter is next. And that's the key thing. And that has to be recognized. This is a cancer that is eating up the American society and has to be looked at. Within the Canadian context, thankfully, we don't have that degree of lackadaisical killings. We do have our own issues, but not at the same scale. I'm delighted to be part of the initiative by the government of Alberta to make changes to the Police Act to ensure that police organizations live up to their creed. And the response from the community or communities has been very positive, overwhelmingly so. We have received a series of recommendations from members of the public as regards the kinds of changes they wish to see. I'm not at liberty, obviously, to share all of those. These are confidential things, but I can confirm that in the main, they deal with issues in relation to de-escalation, in relation to selection of officers, the temperament and the kind of training that they receive, and ensuring that there is a sync between the realities of 21st century policing and the knowledge that is acquired at the police college. So just broadly speaking, those are some of the things we're hearing. Those are some of the things that I am thinking about and engaging about as special advisor on the Police Act Review to the government of Alberta.
As you've mentioned, with these major cases that have occurred and continue to occur in the United States, with this increase of Black Lives Matter calls for accountability, you kind of spoke to this a bit, but what are the potential ripple effects in Canada, especially for Black and Indigenous populations and their calls for action?
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets more and more interesting, and that is that people are traumatized. Black and Indigenous persons are traumatized by these videos. It's been sort of violence pornography that people are subjected to. And so individuals who in fact are not American and might not never have even visited the US are feeling traumatized wherever they are around the world. And there's a reason why the George Floyd killing struck a nerve transnationally, transgenerationally, and transracially because of what it represented, man's inhumanity to man. But what I have tried to make clear in my current role, and even before that, is to say that Edmonton, for example, is not Minneapolis. And so the EPS is not Minneapolis police. That there's a need for perspective. We have our work cut out for us. We have steps we have to take. But that distinction, and it's a very hard one to take because a lot of emotions are involved. People just watched in real time the live streaming of somebody's death or a replay of somebody's death on YouTube. And the digital and permanent identities that those killings have. For a lot of Black folks, they don't simply just shrug and say, oh, well, stuff happens. These killings have a profound effect on people's mental health, on their well-being. It creates issues, even for us here in Canada, even for our own officers, I believe, in terms of people's perceptions of the police. Goes to the very epicenter of the fact that the police are not merely an organization, they are an institution. So that somebody's experience with the police in Calgary or in Edmonton can shape how they perceive police elsewhere. And conversely, what they see on TV about police in New York, given the saturation of the Canadian media market by the US media, there's that tendency to sort of look at all of these police services, radically different police organizations, almost as if they're the same. That's the danger that our being so close to the US poses. And my role has been to say, no, look, we are not that. We have issues we have to deal with, but that's not us. And you can see some of the strides being made, community engagement by the EPS chief and so on. Clearly, there's been a lot of effort in that direction. More still needs to be done. And I believe that as we go on with the review, I believe that we would have a positive result in improving police-community relations in our province.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate the nuance and insight that you've given today, Dr. Oriola. It's an incredibly important conversation and hopefully contributing an impetus for real system changes.
Yeah, I hope so too. And thank you, Ashley, for your fine work with this series. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for joining us for this first episode of our podcast on crime and punishment. Please subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be the Apple Podcast app or Google Podcasts or Pocket Cast, or wherever. Also, please follow our YouTube channel, youtube.com/c/Center for Criminological Research, and follow us on Twitter @CCR_U of A. And we'll be bringing you a lot more content over the summer here, and we will be trying to keep abreast of all of the really important conversations going on in criminology and bringing that, out of the academy for anybody to hear.